My neighbor called the police on my fence 47 times in 1 year, claiming I stole 2 inches of her property. But when the professional surveyor arrived, he discovered SHE was trespassing on MY land. 6 feet of her driveway, moving into a quiet suburban neighborhood in Cedar Hills, should have been the beginning of a peaceful new chapter. The house was perfect. A charming 3-bedroom ranch with a spacious backyard that begged for weekend barbecues and lazy Sunday afternoons. The previous owners had been an elderly couple who maintained everything impeccably, and the property seemed like a dream come true. But dreams have a way of turning into nightmares when the wrong neighbor lives next door. The woman who lived in the house to the right introduced herself on moving day with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her name was Patricia, though that detail would become less important than what she would eventually become known as throughout the neighborhood. She was in her late 50s, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair that never seemed to move in the wind, and she had that particular energy of someone who spent their days monitoring everyone else's business. During that first introduction, she made several comments about how she hoped the new neighbors would maintain the property standards of the neighborhood, how important it was to keep everything just so, and how she had lived there for 15 years and knew exactly how things should be done. The warning signs were all there, but like most people encountering their first Karen in the wild, the red flags were dismissed as mere eccentricity. Perhaps she was just passionate about the neighborhood. Perhaps she was lonely and looking for connection through concern. Perhaps she would warm up once she realized her new neighbors were reasonable, responsible people. All of these perhaps would prove to be catastrophically wrong. The backyard fence became the first project after settling in. The existing fence was ancient, rotting in places, leaning dramatically in others, and generally one strong wind away from complete collapse. It had clearly been neglected for years, probably beyond the capacity of the elderly previous owners to maintain. Multiple sections had already fallen, leaving gaps that made the yard unusable for the dog that would soon be joining the family. Any reasonable person would agree that replacing this hazard was not just reasonable but necessary. Research into local regulations revealed that a 6-foot privacy fence was perfectly legal, required no permit for replacement of an existing fence on an existing property line, and was a standard feature in virtually every yard in the neighborhood. The fence company came out, provided a quote, and explained they would follow the existing fence line exactly, removing the old posts and installing new ones in the same locations. Everything seemed straightforward, professional, and completely routine. The installation took 3 days. The crew arrived early each morning, worked efficiently, and by the end of the 3rd day, a beautiful new cedar fence stood where the rotting eyesore had been. It was perfectly straight, professionally installed, and immediately improved the appearance of the property. The backyard finally felt private, secure, and ready for the life that was planned there. The satisfaction of a job well done lasted approximately 18 hours. The knock on the door came at 7:30 in the morning. 2 police officers stood on the front porch, looking somewhat uncomfortable with their assignment. They explained they had received a complaint from the neighbor about an illegal fence that was apparently encroaching on her property. The officers were professional and apologetic, explaining that they had to respond to all property dispute calls, but they could clearly see this was a civil matter rather than a criminal one. They suggested documenting the existing property markers and perhaps having a conversation with the neighbor to resolve any confusion. That conversation happened later that same day. Patricia stood at her back door, arms crossed, with an expression of righteous indignation that would become incredibly familiar over the coming months. She insisted, with absolute certainty, that the new fence was at least 2 inches onto her property. When asked how she knew this, she explained that she had measured from her driveway to the fence line and it was clearly different than it had been before. The old fence, according to her calculations and memory, had been set back further. This new fence was an encroachment, a property theft, and she would not stand for it. Attempts to explain that the fence followed the exact same line as the previous fence fell on deaf ears. Offers to review the property survey together were dismissed. Suggestions to hire a professional surveyor to settle the matter definitively were met with hostility. In Patricia's mind, the truth was already established, and no amount of evidence or professional opinion would be necessary. She knew her property, she knew her boundaries, and this fence was illegal. conversation ended with her stating firmly that if the fence was not moved immediately, she would take whatever action was necessary to protect her property rights. The second police visit came 4 days later. Then another 5 days after that. Then the calls began to follow a predictable pattern. Every Sunday morning at approximately 8 o'clock, 2 officers would appear at the door, apologize for the disturbance, and explain they had received another complaint about the fence. The officers began to recognize the address, and their sympathy became more evident with each visit. One officer even commented, off the record, that they were becoming quite familiar with this particular neighbor and her tendency to use law enforcement as her personal property management service. By the end of the first month, Patricia had called the police 7 times. 7 separate Sunday mornings had been interrupted by officers who had better things to do than mediate a property line dispute over 2 alleged inches. The police department eventually sent a supervisor who explained, as diplomatically as possible, that this was a civil matter and that continued calls about the same resolved issue could potentially be considered misuse of emergency services. This warning had no effect whatsoever. The calls to the police were just the beginning of Patricia's campaign against the fence. When law enforcement made it clear they would no longer respond to her repeated complaints about the same issue, she simply expanded her strategy to include every other authority figure she could find. The Code Enforcement Office received weekly calls. The city planning department heard from her regularly. The mayor's office got letters. Even the local news station received emails about property rights being violated in Cedar Hills, though they wisely chose not to pursue a story about a fence dispute over 2 inches. Each agency that investigated found the same thing. The fence was legal, properly installed on the property line following the previous fence's footprint, and compliant with all local regulations. Code enforcement came out 3 times in the first 2 months, each time measuring, photographing, and ultimately concluding there was no violation. They even pulled the original property survey from when the house was built in 1987 and confirmed the fence alignment matched the documented boundary. Their reports were clear and unambiguous, but Patricia refused to accept them. The harassment took other forms as well. Patricia began leaving notes on the front door, each one more accusatory than the last. Some were handwritten in angry capital letters, others were typed formal letters threatening legal action. She demanded the fence be removed immediately. She calculated alleged property damages. She claimed the encroachment was affecting her property value and her quality of life. One particularly memorable note included a hand-drawn diagram with measurements that made no mathematical sense, along with the declaration that she had consulted with multiple attorneys who all agreed this was a clear case of property theft. The notes were documented with photographs and timestamps. Every police visit was logged. Every code enforcement inspection was filed away. A dedicated folder began to fill with evidence of what was becoming a clear pattern of harassment. Security cameras were installed, not just for the fence line but covering the front door, driveway, and all sides of the property. If this situation was going to continue escalating, there would be a complete record of everything that happened. The cameras proved invaluable almost immediately. They captured Patricia measuring the fence line at odd hours, sometimes with a tape measure, sometimes with what appeared to be a laser measuring device, always concluding with dramatic gestures of disgust. They recorded her pointing out the fence to visitors, clearly explaining her version of events with animated hand movements and expressions of victimhood. Most disturbingly, the cameras caught her attempting to remove fence posts on 2 separate occasions, each time giving up when she realized the posts were concreted deep into the ground and impossible to move without heavy equipment. Social media became another battlefield. Patricia posted in the neighborhood Facebook group about property line disputes, carefully wording her posts to avoid naming names but making it obvious who she was discussing. She sought sympathy and support, painting herself as a victim of an aggressive new neighbor who had stolen her land. The response was not what she expected. Several longtime residents commented that they remembered the old fence and the new one was in exactly the same place. Others pointed out that property disputes should be handled through proper legal channels rather than social media. A few brave souls even suggested that perhaps she was overreacting about what appeared to be a normally installed fence. These reasonable responses only fueled Patricia's anger. She became more active in the neighborhood group, posting about property rights, boundary laws, and the importance of standing up to bullies. She shared articles about adverse possession, seemingly not understanding that the legal concept worked against her argument rather than supporting it. Her posts became longer, more detailed, and increasingly unhinged. Other neighbors began to comment privately, expressing sympathy and sharing their own stories of Patricia's behavior over the years. Those private conversations were enlightening. Patricia had apparently waged similar campaigns against previous neighbors over various perceived slights. 3 houses down, a family had endured months of complaints about their basketball hoop being too loud. Across the street, someone had been reported to the HOA 17 times for having their garage door open during the day. The previous occupants of the house with the now contentious fence had apparently moved partly to escape Patricia's constant surveillance and complaints about their lawn maintenance schedule. A pattern emerged of a woman who used complaints and reports as weapons to control and punish anyone who didn't meet her exacting standards. The police visits continued despite the earlier warning about misuse of services. Patricia apparently decided that if she varied her complaints slightly each time, they would be considered new issues rather than harassment. One week the fence was an encroachment. The next week it was a safety hazard. Then it was blocking her light. Then it was attracting pests. Then it was depreciating her property value. Each new complaint brought officers back to the door, and each time they became more apologetic and more frustrated with the situation. By month 3, the count of police visits had reached 19. 19 times that officers had been pulled away from real emergencies to address a fence that every official inspection had confirmed was legal and properly placed. The police reports began to reflect the officers' growing irritation with the situation. One report described the complaint as unfounded and repetitive. Another noted that complainant appears to be using police resources inappropriately for a civil matter. The paper trail was building on both sides. The stress of constant harassment began to take its toll. Every Sunday morning brought anxiety about whether this would be another police visit morning. Every day brought the possibility of another angry note, another social media post, another complaint to another agency. The simple joy of the new home was being poisoned by one neighbor's obsessive campaign over an imaginary property line violation. Sleep became difficult. The sound of a car door closing brought immediate tension. Even being in the backyard, which should have been a peaceful retreat, felt like being under surveillance. Friends and family offered various advice. Some suggested just moving the fence to appease her, even though that would mean losing actual property and rewarding harassment. Others recommended getting a lawyer immediately and pursuing a restraining order. A few thought ignoring her completely would make her eventually lose interest and move on to another target. But the most common suggestion, and the one that began to make the most sense, was to fight fire with fire, to get an official, professional property survey that would definitively end the dispute once and for all. The decision to hire a surveyor wasn't made lightly. Professional surveys are expensive, typically costing several $1,000s depending on property size and complexity. It seemed outrageous to spend that money to prove something that was already obviously true, to confirm what multiple code enforcement inspections had already established. But Patricia had made it clear she would never accept anything less than an official survey, and even then, there was no guarantee she would accept reality. Still, having that definitive documentation seemed like the only way to potentially end the nightmare that daily life had become. Finding the right surveyor became the next project. This couldn't just be any company pulled from a quick internet search. The surveyor needed to be licensed, experienced, respected in the legal community, and capable of providing documentation that would hold up in court if the situation continued to escalate. Reviews were read carefully. Credentials were verified. Several companies were contacted and interviewed about their experience with property line disputes and their familiarity with local regulations and standards. The chosen surveying company had been in business for 30 years and had worked on thousands of properties throughout the county. The lead surveyor was a licensed professional with credentials from multiple states and experience testifying as an expert witness in property disputes. His reviews were impeccable, with multiple mentions of his thoroughness, professionalism, and ability to explain complex surveying concepts in understandable terms. If anyone could provide the definitive answer that might finally end Patricia's campaign, it would be this team. The initial consultation took place on a Tuesday afternoon. The surveyor walked the entire property, examining not just the fence line but every boundary marker, every corner stake, and every physical feature that might indicate property lines. He reviewed the original survey from 1987, pointing out where the old boundary markers should be located and noting which ones were still visible after decades of landscaping and natural changes. His preliminary assessment, based on the existing markers and the old survey, was that the fence appeared to be correctly placed. However, the surveyor noted something interesting during his examination. While looking at the property line along the fence, he spent considerable time studying Patricia's driveway, which ran along the side of her house parallel to the shared property line. He took several measurements, consulted his equipment, and made notes with increasing frequency. When asked if something was wrong, he simply said that he wanted to complete his full survey before making any conclusions, but that there might be some interesting findings beyond just confirming the fence location. The formal survey was scheduled for the following week. The surveyor explained that his team would need access to both properties to place equipment and take measurements from multiple angles. This was standard procedure, and typically neighboring property owners were cooperative, understanding that clear boundary documentation benefited everyone. A polite letter was drafted and delivered to Patricia, explaining that a professional survey was being conducted and requesting access to place survey equipment on her property for accurate measurements. Her response arrived 2 days later. The letter from Patricia was predictably hostile. She refused to allow any access to her property, claiming that the survey was a waste of time because she already knew where the boundary was located. She stated that the survey was simply an attempt to intimidate her and make her give up her rightful property. She threatened to call the police if anyone stepped foot on her land. She reiterated her demand that the fence be removed immediately and suggested that the money being wasted on a surveyor would be better spent correcting the illegal encroachment. The letter concluded with another threat of legal action if her property rights continued to be violated. The surveyor was unsurprised by this response. He explained that while property owner cooperation made surveys easier, it wasn't legally required. Survey crews had the right to enter properties to place equipment as long as they didn't damage anything and provided notice, which had been done. Patricia could refuse to answer her door. She could stand outside and watch. She could even take photographs of the process, but she couldn't legally prevent the survey from happening. If she called the police, which she almost certainly would, they would explain the same thing. Survey day arrived with perfect weather, clear skies, no wind, ideal conditions for precise measurements. The surveying team arrived at 8 in the morning with a truck full of equipment: theodolites, GPS receivers, measuring wheels, stakes, flags, and various other tools of their trade. They worked methodically, starting from known county survey markers in the street and working back toward the property. They placed equipment, took readings, moved equipment, and took more readings. The process was fascinating to watch. A combination of high-tech GPS equipment and traditional surveying techniques that had been used for centuries. Patricia emerged from her house within minutes of the crew's arrival. She stood in her driveway with her arms crossed, watching every movement with obvious hostility. She took photographs constantly, as if documenting some crime in progress. When the crew needed to place a piece of equipment near her property line, she announced loudly that she was calling the police. The surveyor calmly explained that they had every legal right to conduct the survey and had provided proper notice. She called anyway. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes, the same 2 who had responded to several of Patricia's previous fence complaints. They recognized everyone immediately, and the look they exchanged spoke volumes. Patricia began her explanation about how these people were trespassing on her property to conduct an illegal survey. The officers listened politely, then asked the surveyor to explain what was happening. After hearing the professional explanation and seeing the notice letter that had been provided, they confirmed that the survey was completely legal and that Patricia could not interfere with it. They suggested she go back inside and let the professionals do their work. Instead, Patricia remained outside for the entire 4-hour survey. She followed the crew at a distance, photographing and occasionally making comments loud enough to be heard about how this was all a waste of time and the truth was already obvious. The surveyors ignored her completely, focused on their work with professional detachment. They measured, calculated, placed stakes, and methodically documented every finding. As the morning progressed, their attention seemed increasingly focused on Patricia's driveway, with multiple measurements taken of its position relative to the established property lines. Lunchtime brought a break in the fieldwork, but the surveyor remained on site, reviewing data on his laptop and checking calculations. He seemed particularly interested in one specific set of measurements, cross-referencing them multiple times and comparing them to the original 1987 survey. He made several phone calls, apparently consulting with his office about specific technical questions. His expression throughout this process was difficult to read. Not concerned exactly, but certainly focused in a way that suggested he had found something significant. The afternoon session involved placing the final property markers and taking verification measurements to confirm the morning's findings. The surveyor placed bright orange stakes at each corner of the property and at regular intervals along each boundary line. The fence line along Patricia's property received special attention, with stakes placed every 10 feet to clearly mark where the surveyor had determined the legal boundary to be located. Each stake was labeled with identification numbers that corresponded to the detailed survey map being created. As the crew was packing up their equipment, the surveyor asked to speak privately inside the house. His demeanor was professional, but there was an undercurrent of something else. Perhaps anticipation, perhaps concern about how the news he was carrying would be received. He spread several documents across the dining room table. The original 1987 survey, his new measurements, aerial photographs from the county GIS system, and several pages of calculations and notes. What he was about to explain would transform this dispute from an annoying neighbor problem into something far more significant. The fence, he confirmed, was exactly where it should be. Every measurement confirmed that the new fence followed the precise property line as established in the original survey and verified by his current professional analysis. The fence posts were within 1/4 inch of the legal boundary line, which was well within acceptable tolerances for fence installation. Patricia's claim about a 2-inch encroachment was completely unfounded. The fence was legal, properly placed, and entirely on the correct property. But that wasn't the interesting part. The surveyor then directed attention to Patricia's driveway. According to his measurements, cross-referenced with the county records and the original survey, her driveway extended approximately 6 feet onto the property where the conversation was taking place. 6 full feet of concrete that she had been driving on, parking on, and claiming as her own for presumably the entire 15 years she had lived there, was actually not her property at all. The driveway she had been so adamant about protecting from a 2-inch fence encroachment was itself a massive encroachment going the other direction. The implications of the surveyor's findings took several moments to fully comprehend. 6 feet of driveway represented roughly 1/3 of Patricia's total driveway width. This wasn't a minor encroachment or a simple mistake of inches. This was a substantial portion of her property's functionality that existed entirely on someone else's land. The surveyor pointed out the measurements on his detailed map, showing exactly where the property line ran and how much of the concrete driveway fell on the wrong side of that line. The questions came rapid fire. How was this possible? How had it gone unnoticed for so long? Was the surveyor absolutely certain about these measurements? He explained patiently that property line mistakes were more common than people realized, especially with older properties where original surveys might not have been followed precisely during construction. Driveways in particular were often installed by contractors who eyeballed placements rather than consulting official surveys. Over time, property owners simply assumed everything within their maintained area was theirs. The surveyor walked through his methodology in detail, explaining how he had used multiple verification methods to ensure absolute accuracy. He had started from county survey monuments in the street, which were permanent markers with known precise coordinates. He had used GPS equipment accurate to within centimeters. He had cross-referenced his findings with the original 1987 survey, with aerial photographs showing property features, and with physical markers that still existed on the property. Every method and every measurement pointed to the same conclusion. The property line ran directly through Patricia's driveway, and a significant portion of that driveway was not on her land. Looking at the aerial photographs made the situation even clearer. The surveyor had pulled images from different years going back 15 years, when Patricia had first moved in. The driveway had been there even before her ownership, installed by a previous owner probably sometime in the 1990s. The original house had been built with a different driveway configuration, but at some point, someone had expanded or reconfigured it, apparently without consulting a survey or verifying property boundaries. Patricia had purchased the house assuming the driveway was entirely on her property, just as she assumed her boundary claims about the fence were accurate. The irony was almost too perfect. For a year, Patricia had been calling the police, harassing her neighbors, and claiming a 2-inch encroachment that didn't exist. She had spent countless hours measuring, complaining, posting on social media, and making everyone's life miserable over her incorrect belief that her property was being stolen. Meanwhile, she had been using 6 feet of someone else's property every single day, driving over it, treating it as her own, and doing so with absolute confidence in her righteousness. The surveyor provided 3 certified copies of his findings, each one an official legal document complete with his professional seal and license number. These documents would hold up in any court, in any legal proceeding, and would be recognized as definitive proof of property boundaries by any judge or lawyer who reviewed them. He also provided a detailed written report explaining his methodology, his findings, and his professional opinion that the fence was legally placed while the driveway was not. The documentation was comprehensive, professional, and utterly damning to Patricia's year-long campaign. The next decision was crucial. How should this information be used? Several options presented themselves, each with different potential outcomes. The simplest approach would be to simply present the survey to Patricia and wait for her to absorb the reality of the situation. Perhaps shame and embarrassment would cause her to finally drop her fence complaints and retreat from her harassment campaign. Perhaps she would apologize, though that seemed unlikely given her behavior over the past year. A more aggressive approach would be to immediately demand she remove her driveway from the property, mirroring her own demands about the fence. This would be satisfying in its poetic justice, but it would also escalate an already tense situation into outright warfare. It might feel good in the moment, but it would guarantee years of additional conflict, legal battles, and stress. The goal had never been revenge, just peace and the ability to enjoy the property without constant harassment. A middle path seemed most reasonable. The survey would be shared with Patricia, not as an aggressive attack but as factual information from a licensed professional. It would be accompanied by a request that she immediately cease all complaints, police calls, and harassment regarding the fence, which had now been definitively proven to be legally and correctly placed. In exchange, there would be no immediate demand for her to remove or modify her driveway. A reasonable period would be provided for her to process the information and decide how she wanted to handle the encroachment on her side. The letter was drafted carefully, reviewed by an attorney to ensure it was appropriately worded, and prepared for delivery along with copies of the survey results. The tone was factual rather than gloating, professional rather than aggressive. It presented the survey findings, noted that the fence had been conclusively proven to be properly placed, and requested an end to the harassment. It acknowledged that the driveway situation was likely an honest mistake from before her ownership and expressed willingness to discuss reasonable solutions that wouldn't require immediate reconstruction. Before delivering this information to Patricia, one more conversation needed to happen. The surveyor was asked about legal rights and options regarding the driveway encroachment. His answer was straightforward. As the property owner, there was absolute legal right to demand the encroachment be removed. The driveway portion on the property could be torn out, and Patricia would be responsible for all costs. Alternatively, an easement could be negotiated, where she would be granted legal permission to keep her driveway where it was in exchange for some form of compensation or agreement. Or the situation could simply be allowed to continue as is, with the knowledge that the legal high ground was firmly established. The surveyor also explained the concept of adverse possession, which Patricia had incorrectly tried to use in her favor during her social media campaign. In this state, adverse possession required continuous, open, and hostile use of property for 21 years. Patricia had only been there for 15 years, and the driveway had only existed for about 25 years total. Even if the previous owner's time counted, which was legally questionable, the time frame was barely sufficient, and Patricia would have to prove she had maintained the area openly and hostilely, which would be difficult given that she probably had no idea it wasn't her property until now. More importantly, the surveyor explained, adverse possession claims fail when the true property owner takes action to defend their property rights. By ordering and conducting this survey, by documenting the encroachment, and by preparing to formally notify Patricia of the property line location, any potential adverse possession claim was effectively ended. The clock, if it had been running at all, had been stopped. The property rights were now clearly asserted and documented beyond any legal dispute. Armed with this information and the certified survey documents, preparations were made for the conversation that would hopefully end Patricia's year-long campaign. The decision was made to deliver the information in person rather than simply leaving it in her mailbox. This deserved a face-to-face meeting, both to ensure she actually received and understood the information, and admittedly, to see her reaction when confronted with the truth she had been denying for so long. The security cameras were checked to ensure they were recording properly. A friend was asked to be present as a witness to the conversation. The survey documents were placed in a professional folder along with the carefully worded letter. Everything was documented, prepared, and ready. After a year of harassment, after 47 police calls, after countless sleepless nights and constant anxiety, the moment of truth had finally arrived. Patricia was about to learn that her crusade against a 2-inch imaginary encroachment had been conducted while she herself was guilty of exactly what she had been accusing others of, but on a scale 20 times larger. The walk across the yard to Patricia's front door felt longer than it actually was. This was the moment that would define whether the past year of harassment would finally end or whether it would escalate into even more complicated legal territory. The survey folder felt heavy with significance, containing as it did the irrefutable truth that would shatter Patricia's confident righteousness. Whatever happened next, at least there would finally be closure on the question of where the property line actually was, and which neighbor had been violating that line all along. The doorbell echoed through Patricia's house, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching. Through the decorative glass panels in the door, her silhouette appeared, and there was a visible pause when she recognized who was standing on her porch. The door opened only partially, held by a chain lock, and Patricia's face appeared in the gap with an expression that mixed suspicion, annoyance, and that particular smugness she had worn throughout the entire fence dispute. She clearly assumed this was another attempt to convince her to drop her complaints, another futile effort to make her accept the unacceptable. The opening statement was simple and direct. A professional property survey had been completed by a licensed surveyor, and the results needed to be shared with her. The folder was held up visibly, showing the surveying company's logo and the official-looking documents inside. Patricia's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something that might have been concern crossing her face before the smugness returned. She stated that she didn't need to see any survey because she already knew where her property lines were, and no expensive surveyor was going to change the truth that the fence was on her land. The response was patient but firm. The survey had been completed regardless of whether she wanted to see it, and the results were now a matter of legal record. She could choose to review the findings now, or she could wait and review them later when they became relevant in potential legal proceedings. But either way, the survey existed, it was official, and it was definitive. This seemed to give her pause. The mention of legal proceedings carried weight, and her confidence wavered slightly as she processed the implications. After a long moment, she removed the chain and opened the door wider, though she made no move to invite anyone inside. The folder was opened right there on the doorstep. The first document presented was the surveyor's title page and credentials, showing his license number, his professional certifications, and the official seal that marked this as a legally binding document. Patricia barely glanced at it, still maintaining her attitude that this was all unnecessary theater. The next page showed the property overview, a detailed map showing both properties, the street, and all relevant features. She looked at this more carefully, her eyes scanning the document as if searching for obvious errors she could point out. Then came the critical page, the detailed drawing of the fence line and the property boundary. The surveyor had marked the legal property line in bold red, with measurements indicated at regular intervals. The fence was shown in blue, running precisely along that red line with notation indicating it was within acceptable tolerance of the legal boundary. Patricia stared at this page, her finger tracing the lines as if she could somehow find a discrepancy through sheer force of will. The measurements were clear, the documentation was thorough, and the conclusion was inescapable. The fence was exactly where it was supposed to be. Her face began to change as the reality of the situation started to penetrate her certainty. The smugness faded, replaced by confusion, then frustration, then a desperate search for some explanation that would preserve her version of reality. She began to sputter objections. The surveyor must have made a mistake. The measurements couldn't be right. She had measured it herself and knew the fence was on her property. This was just one surveyor's opinion and other surveyors would disagree. The arguments came rapid fire, each one more desperate than the last. The flailing of someone watching their entire narrative collapse. The response remained calm and factual. This wasn't one surveyor's opinion, it was professional documentation using state-certified equipment and methodology. The surveyor had used multiple verification methods, all of which confirmed the same result. The measurements were accurate to within fractions of an inch. Most importantly, this survey matched the original property survey from 1987, meaning the fence had always been correctly placed and her measurements had always been wrong. She had spent a year harassing her neighbors, calling police 47 times, and making everyone miserable over a property encroachment that had never existed, except in her imagination. Patricia's face flushed red, a combination of embarrassment and anger warring for dominance in her expression. She insisted that she would get her own surveyor, that this documentation must be flawed, that there was no way she had been wrong for an entire year. The folder was extended toward her, offering her the copy of the survey that had been prepared for her. She needed to take it, to review it, and to understand that the fence dispute was over and her complaints needed to stop immediately. Her hand reached out automatically to take the folder, but she was barely looking at it, still processing the collapse of her certainty. Then the second shoe dropped. Before she could retreat into her house with the survey documents, there was one more thing she needed to understand. The surveyor had documented the entire property boundary, not just the fence line. In the course of that documentation, he had discovered something else that required discussion. Patricia's attention snapped back, her expression shifting to confusion. What else could possibly be relevant? Her property line was her property line, end of story. What she was about to learn would transform confusion into shock, then horror, then denial even stronger than her previous conviction about the fence. The surveyor's second finding was presented simply and factually. The property line didn't just run along the fence. It continued along the side of her property, between her house and the driveway. According to the certified survey, based on the original property boundaries and confirmed through multiple measurement methods, approximately 6 feet of her driveway was not actually on her property. It was on the property she had spent a year claiming was encroaching on hers by 2 inches. The irony hung in the air between the two neighbors, heavy and undeniable. Patricia's reaction was immediate and visceral. She rejected the claim instantly, completely, and with even more vehemence than she had initially rejected the fence findings. That was impossible. Her driveway had been there for decades. She had lived there for 15 years and had always maintained that driveway as her property. No surveyor could simply declare that her driveway wasn't hers. This had to be a mistake or a lie or some kind of revenge tactic for her legitimate complaints about the fence. Her voice rose in pitch and volume, the words tumbling out in a torrent of denial and accusation. The folder was opened again, this time to the pages showing the driveway measurements. The property line was marked in bold red, running straight and true from the street to the back of the property. The driveway was shown in gray, and the portion that crossed over the red line into the neighboring property was shaded and labeled clearly. 6 feet and 2 inches, to be precise. The surveyor had measured it down to the inch. The documentation showed the encroachment from multiple angles, with measurements, coordinates, and references to both the original survey and county records. Patricia grabbed the folder from reluctant hands, her fingers shaking slightly as she flipped through the pages. She studied each one intensely, searching for the error that would prove this wrong, that would restore her reality to what it had been 5 minutes earlier. Her lips moved as she read the surveyor's notes, her face growing paler as the technical language and precise measurements reinforced the inescapable conclusion. The driveway she had driven on thousands of times, the driveway she had walked across to deliver her angry notes about fence encroachment, that driveway was substantially on someone else's property. The silence stretched out as she processed this information. When she finally looked up from the documents, her expression had changed completely. The righteousness was gone. The smugness had evaporated. What remained was a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and a desperate need to find some way out of this situation that preserved even a shred of her dignity. She opened her mouth several times to speak, but no words came out. What could she say? How could she possibly respond to the revelation that her year-long campaign against a 2-inch imaginary encroachment had been conducted while she was guilty of a 72-inch real encroachment? Finally, she found her voice, and her first response was entirely predictable. She would get her own surveyor. She would prove this survey was wrong. There was no way her driveway was on anyone else's property, and she would have documentation to prove it. She would not accept these findings, and she certainly would not be intimidated into dropping her legitimate complaints about the fence. This was clearly all an elaborate scheme to distract from the real issue, which was still the fence encroachment. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, denial remained her primary defense mechanism. The folder she was clutching contained not just the survey but also a formal letter outlining these terms. She was to read it carefully, consult with an attorney if she wished, and respond within 7 days. If her harassment continued despite this definitive proof that she had been wrong, then the situation would escalate to legal action, including potentially requiring her to remove the portion of her driveway that encroached on the neighboring property. If she chose to be reasonable, then reasonable solutions could be discussed, possibly including a formal easement agreement that would allow her driveway to remain where it was. Patricia stood in her doorway, still holding the folder, looking smaller somehow than she had at the beginning of the conversation. The confidence and aggression that had characterized every previous interaction had drained away, replaced by visible uncertainty. She looked at the survey documents again, then at her driveway visible from where she stood, then back at the documents. The cognitive dissonance was written clearly on her face, the struggle between what she had believed so absolutely and what the evidence was now showing her. One final point needed to be made before the conversation ended. Over the past year, she had called the police 47 times about a fence that was legally and properly placed. 47 times she had wasted law enforcement resources on a false claim. 47 times she had caused harassment and disruption over a property encroachment that existed only in her imagination. Meanwhile, she had been committing an actual, substantial property encroachment every single day. The hypocrisy of the situation should be obvious even to her. The question now was whether she could accept reality and move forward reasonably, or whether her pride would force the situation into destructive legal warfare that she could not possibly win. The friend who had been standing slightly back as a witness had been recording the entire conversation on a phone, as Patricia had been informed at the beginning. This recording, combined with the survey documentation, the year's worth of police reports, and all the other evidence that had been accumulated, painted a very clear picture of who had been reasonable and who had been unreasonable throughout this dispute. If this ended up in court, no judge would have any difficulty determining which neighbor had been in the wrong. Patricia's response was barely audible. She said she needed to review the documents more carefully, that she needed to think about all of this, that she needed time to process. For the first time in a year, she didn't make threats or accusations. She didn't insist on her version of events or dismiss the evidence presented to her. She simply stood there, deflated and uncertain, holding a folder that had just destroyed her entire narrative and exposed her year-long crusade as completely baseless. The transformation was almost pitiable, watching someone's absolute certainty crumble so completely. The conversation ended with a simple reminder of the 7-day deadline for her response. She was expected to either acknowledge the survey results and agree to cease her harassment, or to provide her own professional survey that contradicted these findings, though she should be aware that no legitimate surveyor would reach different conclusions based on the same property markers and county records. Until she responded, it would be assumed she was reviewing her options and considering how to proceed. But any further police calls, complaints, or harassment before that response would be considered bad faith and would result in immediate legal action. Patricia nodded slightly, still looking at the documents in her hands rather than making eye contact. She mumbled something that might have been acknowledgement, then stepped back into her house and closed the door slowly. Through the glass panels, her silhouette remained visible for several moments, standing motionless in her entryway, still holding the folder. Then she moved deeper into the house and disappeared from view. The conversation that had been anticipated with such intensity was over, and it had gone better than any realistic expectation. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't called the police during the conversation, and she hadn't torn up the survey documents. She had simply been confronted with truth too documented and too official to dismiss, and it had visibly shaken her. Walking back across the property line, the now definitively established and documented property line, felt different than the walk over had felt. The weight of a year's worth of harassment seemed lighter somehow. The constant anxiety about what Patricia might do next, what complaint she might file, what scene she might cause, had shifted. She now knew the truth. She had the survey results in her hands. She understood that her position was completely indefensible. Whether she would accept reality gracefully or go down fighting remained to be seen, but at least the truth was now out in the open, documented beyond any reasonable dispute. The rest of the day was spent in a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. Relief that the confrontation had happened and had gone relatively well. Anticipation about how Patricia would respond once she fully processed the information. The security cameras were monitored periodically, showing Patricia's house remaining quiet with no visible activity. No police cars arrived. No angry notes appeared on the door. The evening passed peacefully, the first evening in recent memory without some form of anxiety about what the neighbor might do next. Sleep came easier that night than it had in months. The knowledge that the truth was documented, that the legal position was unassailable, that the moral high ground was firmly established, all of it contributed to a sense of security that had been absent for a year. Whatever happened next, it would be Patricia who was on the defensive, Patricia who had to explain her actions, Patricia who had to deal with the consequences of her year-long campaign of harassment based on false claims. Justice might not be swift, but it had finally arrived, delivered in the form of a certified property survey and measured in feet and inches that didn't lie. The first indication that Patricia had truly absorbed the survey results came 2 days later. The mail contained a letter from an attorney's office, and for a brief moment, anxiety spiked at the thought that she might be escalating to litigation despite having no legal ground to stand on. However, the letter wasn't a lawsuit threat or a demand. It was a formal acknowledgement that Patricia had reviewed the survey, had consulted with legal counsel, and understood that her previous complaints about the fence had been unfounded. The letter requested a meeting to discuss potential solutions regarding the driveway situation. The tone of the attorney's letter was professional and notably humble. It acknowledged that emotions had run high during the dispute, that mistakes had been made in understanding property boundaries, and that all parties would benefit from resolving the outstanding issues in a reasonable manner. There was no mention of Patricia's year of harassment, no acknowledgement of the 47 police calls or the constant complaints. But the absence of any demands or threats represented a complete reversal from every previous communication that had come from her direction. Consulting with an attorney before responding to this letter seemed prudent. The same lawyer who had reviewed the initial letter to Patricia was consulted about next steps. His advice was pragmatic. Patricia was clearly trying to avoid the humiliation and expense of having to reconstruct her driveway, and she was now approaching the situation from a position of complete legal weakness. This was an opportunity to not only end the harassment permanently but also to potentially receive compensation for the year of stress, the cost of the survey, and the ongoing use of the property that her driveway occupied. The response letter was carefully crafted to be firm but not vindictive. It acknowledged her attorney's communication and expressed willingness to discuss reasonable solutions. However, any agreement would need to include several non-negotiable elements. A written apology for the year of harassment, a commitment to never again file false complaints about the fence or any other aspect of the property, reimbursement for the cost of the professional survey that had been necessitated by her baseless accusations, and appropriate compensation for a permanent easement allowing her driveway to remain where it was. The amount requested for the easement was calculated based on the square footage of encroachment and comparable land values in the area. 6 feet of driveway extending the full depth of her property represented approximately 300 square feet of land. At current land values, that property was worth roughly $15,000. The easement request was for $10,000, a discount from full value that acknowledged she had purchased the house in good faith, not knowing about the encroachment, but still substantial enough to reflect the serious nature of what was being granted. The survey cost reimbursement was straightforward, $3,000 that had been spent to definitively prove what should have been obvious from the beginning. Patricia's refusal to accept the fence placement had necessitated this expense, and it was entirely reasonable that she should bear that cost. The written apology was non-negotiable and non-financial. It needed to be sincere, specific, and include acknowledgement of the harassment and its impacts. It would be kept private rather than demanded to be public, allowing her to maintain some dignity while still taking responsibility for her actions. The meeting to discuss these terms took place 1 week later in a neutral location at her attorney's office. Patricia attended with her lawyer, looking significantly different than she had during any previous interaction. Gone was the aggressive confidence and righteous indignation. She appeared tired, embarrassed, and notably subdued. Her attorney did most of the talking, discussing the various terms and attempting to negotiate some of the financial aspects downward. But even his negotiations were half-hearted, both of them clearly aware that they had no leverage whatsoever in this situation. Patricia's attorney made the case that $10,000 for the easement was excessive, suggesting that $5,000 would be more reasonable given that the driveway had existed before her client's ownership of the property. The response was simple. The driveway had existed illegally before her ownership and had continued to exist illegally during her ownership. She had benefited from the use of someone else's property for 15 years without compensation. She had also spent the past year harassing the property owner while simultaneously trespassing on that same property daily. $10,000 was already a discounted rate, and it was non-negotiable. The survey reimbursement was challenged next, with her attorney suggesting that both parties had benefited from the survey's clarity and therefore should split the cost. This argument was easily dismissed. The survey had been necessary solely because of Patricia's baseless accusations and her refusal to accept the fence placement. If she had been reasonable at any point during the previous year, the survey would never have been needed. She had forced this expense through her behavior, and she would bear the full cost of it. The attorney backed down quickly, recognizing this was an unwinnable argument. Discussion of the written apology made Patricia visibly uncomfortable. She looked like she wanted to object, to minimize her behavior, to explain herself in a way that made her actions seem more reasonable than they had been. But her attorney placed a hand on her arm, and she remained silent. He asked if the apology could be structured in a way that acknowledged miscommunication and mutual misunderstanding rather than placing all blame on his client. The answer was no. The apology needed to acknowledge reality. She had been wrong about the fence, her complaints had been baseless, and her behavior had constituted harassment. There was no mutual miscommunication. There was her year-long campaign based on false claims. After nearly an hour of discussion, Patricia's attorney requested a private consultation with his client. They stepped into an adjoining conference room for 15 minutes, during which time muffled conversation could occasionally be heard through the door. When they returned, Patricia looked even more deflated than before. Her attorney announced that his client was prepared to accept all terms as presented. The $10,000 easement payment, the $3,000 survey reimbursement, and the written apology would all be provided. In exchange, she would receive a permanent recorded easement allowing her driveway to remain in place, and assurance that the police reports and documentation of her harassment would not be shared publicly or used against her except if she ever renewed her complaints. The relief on Patricia's face when the agreement was announced was visible and genuine. She had clearly expected worse, perhaps a demand that she actually remove her driveway or a public shaming for her year of behavior. The terms were strict but not destructive, firm but not vindictive. She would pay a substantial amount of money and have to acknowledge her mistakes, but her life wouldn't be ruined and her home wouldn't require expensive reconstruction. It was, in many ways, a much better outcome than her behavior over the past year had earned her. The written apology was delivered 3 days later, composed on her personal stationery and clearly written by her rather than drafted by her attorney. It was surprisingly comprehensive and, to the extent such things can be judged, appeared sincere. She acknowledged that her complaints about the fence had been unfounded and based on incorrect understanding of property boundaries. She admitted that her repeated police calls had been excessive and inappropriate. She expressed regret for the stress and disruption her behavior had caused. She thanked the neighbor for being willing to work out a reasonable solution regarding her driveway rather than insisting on its removal. The apology didn't excuse or explain her behavior beyond acknowledging she had been convinced she was right and had allowed that conviction to justify increasingly inappropriate actions. It didn't claim she had meant well or had been trying to protect her property rights. It simply stated that she had been wrong, had behaved badly, and was sorry for her actions. As apologies go, particularly apologies forced as part of legal settlements, it was about as good as could be hoped for. Whether she truly felt remorse or simply recognized she had no choice, the words on paper represented a complete reversal from her previous stance. The financial aspects of the settlement were completed 2 weeks later. A cashier's check for $13,000 was delivered by her attorney, representing the easement payment and survey reimbursement. In exchange, she received a professionally drafted easement agreement that was recorded with the county, permanently granting her the right to maintain her driveway in its current location. The easement included terms requiring her to maintain the driveway in good condition and specifying that any future modifications would require written approval. It protected both parties. She could keep her driveway, but couldn't expand or modify it further onto the property. The recorded easement meant the entire dispute was now a matter of public record. Anyone researching the properties would be able to see the survey results, the property boundaries, and the formal easement agreement. Future buyers of either property would have clear documentation of exactly where boundaries were located and what rights existed regarding the driveway. The ambiguity that had allowed the initial dispute to occur was permanently eliminated. Property lines were now matters of certified fact rather than opinion or assumption. Life in the neighborhood changed dramatically after the settlement. Patricia became notably reclusive, rarely seen outside except for necessary errands. When she did appear, she avoided eye contact and hurried through any outdoor activities. The social media postings stopped entirely, her accounts went silent, no longer sharing neighborhood opinions or property rights articles. She resigned from her position on the Neighborhood Watch Committee, citing personal reasons. The dramatic personality that had been so prominent in neighborhood affairs simply withdrew from public engagement. Other neighbors noticed the change and quietly inquired about what had happened. The response was always diplomatic. There had been a property line dispute that was now resolved through professional survey and mutual agreement. The details of Patricia's year-long harassment campaign and the ironic discovery about her driveway were kept private, honoring the spirit of the settlement even though there was no legal requirement to do so. She had been humbled enough without adding public humiliation to her consequences. The fence stood exactly where it had always stood, a simple cedar privacy barrier that had somehow sparked a year-long war. Looking at it now, it seemed impossible that such an ordinary structure could have generated 47 police calls, countless hours of stress, thousands of dollars in legal and surveying fees, and the complete transformation of a neighborhood relationship. But property disputes have a way of bringing out the worst in people, especially when pride and certainty override reason and evidence. The backyard finally became what it was always meant to be, a peaceful private space for relaxation and enjoyment. The dog that had been the original motivation for replacing the fence now played there safely, completely unaware of the human drama that had unfolded over the barrier that protected her. Weekend barbecues happened without anxiety. Lazy Sunday mornings were spent in the yard without wondering if this would be another police visit day. The simple pleasure of using and enjoying one's own property, which should have been the baseline experience, felt like a hard-won victory. The security cameras remained in place, a permanent reminder that documentation and evidence matter when dealing with unreasonable people. They no longer captured dramatic confrontations or fence measuring sessions, but they provided peace of mind that any future issues would be thoroughly documented. The folder of police reports, code enforcement visits, and harassment documentation was filed away but not discarded. It represented proof that sometimes standing firm on truth and evidence, even when it's expensive and stressful, leads to eventual justice. The survey itself, that expensive but ultimately invaluable document, was framed and hung in the home office. Not as a trophy or a symbol of victory over a difficult neighbor, but as a reminder of an important lesson. Assumptions about property boundaries, no matter how confident, are no substitute for professional documentation. Patricia had assumed she knew where her property lines were and had built an entire crusade on that faulty assumption. The surveyor's precise measurements had revealed the truth, and that truth had been far different than anyone expected. Months passed, then a year. Patricia eventually moved, selling her house to a young couple who seemed pleasant and reasonable. The disclosure documents for her sale included the easement agreement, ensuring the new owners understood the driveway situation from the beginning. They expressed no concern about it. The driveway was where it was, the agreement was in place, and everyone knew exactly where all property lines were located. It was, ironically, the clarity and certainty that Patricia had claimed to want all along. The fence aged naturally, the cedar weathering to a soft gray that blended beautifully with the landscape. It never encroached on anyone's property because it had never encroached to begin with. It simply existed where it had always been meant to exist, a physical boundary that marked the legal line between properties. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one. The fence was fine, it had always been fine, and one neighbor's obsessive certainty had been wrong from the very first complaint. The story became a cautionary tale shared quietly among neighbors, not as gossip, but as a genuine lesson about the importance of verification before accusation, about the dangers of letting certainty override evidence, and about how pride can turn a simple misunderstanding into a year-long nightmare. It was also a story about justice, about how truth and documentation eventually prevail even against aggressive and persistent harassment. In the end, the fence dispute that had consumed a year of energy, money, and stress was resolved not through escalating conflict, but through objective professional measurement. The 47 police calls led nowhere. The social media campaigns convinced no one. The angry notes and constant complaints accomplished nothing. What finally ended the dispute was what should have been the first resort rather than the last. Getting a professional to measure the actual property line and accepting the results regardless of preconceptions. The property remained peaceful, the boundaries clear, and the lesson learned. Sometimes the most important investment isn't the fence itself, but the survey that proves where that fence belongs. And sometimes the sweetest victory isn't revenge or public humiliation of an adversary, but simply the restoration of peace and the vindication of truth. The fence stood as it always had, legal and proper, a silent testament to the value of evidence over assumption and patience over escalation.